Welcome. My name's Marlene Westerveld and with me today is Jessica Painter. We're from Griffith University and we're going to be talking about emergent literacy development in young children on the autism spectrum. Let's get started. So why literacy in autism? Well, as we all know, literacy helps us connect with the world around us. It's a cornerstone of academic success. And as it says, literacy proficiency is linked to better academic achievement, better socio-emotional well-being, better academic outcomes, and better vocational attainment. Literacy is a basic human right. So what we know is that about 92% of children with autism spectrum disorder experience challenges in education due to social, communication, and learning difficulties. Now we know that 70% of children on the spectrum are now attending mainstream primary schools. That means that a majority of teachers can reasonably expect to have one or more students on the autism spectrum in their classes each year. So autism, by definition, is a highly heterogeneous group and with uneven cognitive profiles. So what this means is that there's no one size fits all for inclusion. Did you know, however, that about 50% of children on the spectrum struggle to read, and that some of these children do not learn to read at all? A majority of children on the spectrum will show difficulties in reading comprehension, and I'll be unpacking those constructs a little bit later on. So knowing how these children develop their early literacy skills will help guide early supports. And that's what we've been interested in and researching in the last 5 or 6 years. So let's briefly look at some theory. Some of you, perhaps all of you, may have heard of the simple view of reading. So what that is that reading comprehension, which we would all agree is the ultimate aim of learning to read, is word recognition times language comprehension. So that means recognizing the words on the page or decoding the words on the page, in purple on this slide, times language comprehension. So that's our ability to understand spoken language. We need both of these skills for reading comprehension to occur. And if one of them is 0, then reading comprehension is 0. And one of my favorite examples here is Samoan. So I'm pretty good at decoding Samoan language, or so I've been told, because the vowels are very similar to the Dutch vowels that I grew up with. But because my language comprehension of Samoan is pretty low, I probably can understand about 1 or 2 words. There is no reading comprehension, even if I'm able, or even though I'm able to decode most of the words on a page. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that these unique and shared contributions of word recognition and language comprehension actually change across the grades. So as you can see on this graph, in 2nd grade, so this is an American one, so it's really that 2nd year of schooling, in the blue, word recognition has a big sort of impact on reading comprehension. But by the time children reach 4th and then 8th grade, this contribution is very, very low. And that is because during the early years of schooling, children will generally learn to decode the written words accurately and fluently. And then by 4th grade, that language comprehension becomes a bigger predictor. And by 8th grade, it is really important to the reading comprehension process. So what this means is that during that 1st year of schooling, when children learn to read, they're generally exposed to very simple texts that really do not tax their language comprehension to a great extent. By 4th grade, we're going to be assuming that these kids are good decoders. And at that stage, if those children struggle in their language comprehension, their reading comprehension will become compromised. So children move from learning to read to learning through reading. So how do children then develop those early literacy skills, right? What sort of skills do they bring to school? Well, literacy learning happens long before children start their formal schooling. And they learn that through interactions with adults, such as shared book reading or playing with writing utensils, pretending to read books or acting out sort of literacy themes like the big bad wolf, engaging in literacy-related plays or games, but also being exposed to environmental print. For example, many of our preschoolers these days will know that the big yellow arches of McDonald's stand for the sound or the letter M. So what I also want to point out is that some children, even though most of these children go through the emergent literacy period before they start formal schooling, there will be a percentage of children who may stay in this period during the first few years of school, if not during their whole primary schooling period. And we'll come back to this a little bit later when we talk about variability in early literacy learning. Okay. So what are these key emergent literacy skills that are predictive of later word recognition and language comprehension? So first of all, we need strong print-related skills to decode the written words. So on the left-hand side of this slide, in purple, you can see what those skills are, and I'll be unpacking those in the next few slides. So they are alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, print concepts, and emergent name writing. And then we need strong oral language related skills or oral language skills to understand the written word. So that's that language comprehension. And the three that we'll talk about is vocabulary knowledge, grammatical ability, and story retelling and comprehension. So alphabet knowledge is actually quite easy to assess. So what we do is we want to know, do children recognize the name or the letters by name, or can they name the letters? And do they know the sounds of the letters, or can they tell us what sounds they make? And we show children a sheet with 26 letters, and we may screen off some of the letters to make it easier, and we simply tally how many letter sounds and or names they know. So phonological awareness is actually the conscious awareness that spoken language is made up of sounds. So we don't need to be able to read or write to have phonological awareness. It's really a spoken language skill. So that typically develops from larger to smaller linguistic units. So first of all, children will be able to recognize syllables in words. So for example, my name, Marlene's got 2 syllables. Onset rhyme, my name starts with a sound, so Arlene if you want to look at it that way. And then phonemes is when we break a name or a word up into individual sounds. So as you can see here, we've got dog, house. D is the onset for dog, and d, o, g makes dog. So phonological awareness can be seen in children, typically developing children as young as 3 years of age. And then usually they can sort of identify the syllables. But we are particularly interested in those phoneme level awareness. For example, what is the first sound in dog? Because that skill is particularly predictive of early word recognition development. Then we look at print concepts, and basically what that means is we want to know, how do books work? Like, how do you hold a book? We may hand the child the book upside down, and we just want to know, does the child turn it over? Does the child open it up? Does the child go to the first page, for example? Do they know that we read from front to back? Well, we do in Australia anyway, page by page, top to bottom. And also we want to find out, do children know that the words are separated by spaces, that there's a difference between words, letters, numbers, and so on. So we may ask children to point to a word or point to all the words in a sentence and so on. Then we ask children to write their name, so we can see some sort of different attempts on this slide. And what we do is we then code them, so there's a coding scheme, and again we're more than happy to share references with you at the end, and I'll make sure I'll upload a bibliography if you're interested in that. And then afterwards we say, what does that say? Because we want to know, has the child simply learned to sort of write the letters and doesn't really have an understanding that these letters carry meaning, or that each letter stands for a separate sound. So then we'll go to the other side of my little box that I showed you before, and we'll look at oral language skills. And as I said, it includes vocabulary, grammar and story retelling comprehension skills. And what we notice that vocabulary is such a powerful predictor. So the more words you know, the more likely you are to become a better reader. But good vocabulary alone is actually not enough. And we know that story retelling skills in particular have been shown to be predictive of future academic performance. And some people actually refer to it as the bridge to literacy, because it's quite a tricky skill if you pull it apart. So the way we test vocabulary is that we actually do particular standardized tests to see how many words does the child know, and then we can compare that to sort of age expectations. We can also test it by asking the child to, for example, tell a story or to engage in conversation. And we may then look at how many different words does the child use and what types of words. Are they all very simple words, simple nouns, simple verbs? Or are they more your tier 2 words, or they are words that we don't typically encounter in everyday conversation? And then when we look at oral narrative, we're particularly interested in fictional stories. So what we do is we want to know the child's ability to answer questions, and we want to know factual questions like who was in the story or what happened at the end, as well as inferential types of questions like why did the character get bored, or why did the character try and catch the mouse, for example. I'm just making this up. We also want to know what's the quality of the retell. Is it a good story? Is there a good story structure to it? Does it adhere to this typical model of a story that we are so used to? So is there a problem to this story? Do the characters try to resolve the problem? And then we want to know what is the child's ability to use correct grammar and appropriate vocabulary when retelling the story. And we do know that oral narrative ability, even as young as, in preschool, in typically developing children, is a really important predictor of future reading comprehension skills. But of course, if we think about the fact that children develop their literacy skills prior to school entry, we really want to have a look at the home literacy environment to understand how the child is learning these skills and who may help the child learn these skills. So what we know is that frequency of shared book reading is positively related to expressive vocabulary. So it's how many the words the child is using in 4-year-old children. We also know that frequency of book reading is associated with higher levels of print knowledge, so knowing more letter sounds, better phonological awareness in typically developing children. But of course, we should not underestimate the importance of the quality of shared book reading. So it's not just how many times a week do I read the book, but also how do I read the book and how do I engage the child in reading the book, and is the child an active participant? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run you through some of our findings, and you can just see some examples of the work that we've published over the last few years. And then following that, Jess is going to talk to you about why do we think some of children with autism who've been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder might be at particular risk of reading difficulties. Okay. So back a few years ago, we started a preschool study, and we wanted to look at children's emergent literacy skills. So we had 57 families with preschoolers on the spectrum who participated in our study. And what we did is we had a big battery of tasks, tapping into print-related skills and assessing meaning-related skills, as you can see on the slide. So those are the kind of tasks that I've just explained to you. But we adapted all the tasks. We adapted them for duration to make sure they were as quick as possible, so that if children didn't engage for very long, that we could still get some quality responses from them. And we adapted them for language complexity, because so many of the typical assessments that we use in speech pathology and psychology and education, no doubt, are so difficult to understand, or the instructions are so long that by the time we've explained some of the tasks, little Johnny might have left the room or simply lost interest. So our only entry criteria were that the children had to speak in short sentences, so these were all verbal children on the autism spectrum, and that they could participate in preschool type activities. So they could actually sit for at least 5 minutes and point to pictures on request. And they were all prior to school entry. We then asked parents to video themselves reading a book to their child, and we asked them to complete quite a long home literacy questionnaire to really get an understanding of what's going on. Okay, so our questions, probably not surprisingly, is we wanted to know, how do preschoolers on the spectrum perform on both print-related and meaning-related emergent literacy skills? Is their performance prior to school entry predictive of their performance 1 year later? And what may explain some of the difficulties these preschoolers have in literacy-related skills? So based on prior literature, we definitely expected some difficulties, but very few studies had actually specifically looked at children or followed children prior to school entry to school entry. And of course, if performance prior to school entry is predictive of performance 1 or 2 years later, then that will really help guide our early intervention practices, which is ultimately what we're interested in. How can we promote emergent literacy learning to make sure that all children become successful readers? Okay, so what did we find? So what I'm going to do is, rather than run you through all the results individually, I've put it on one graph. And I'll briefly explain what this graph means. So what you can see is the blocks, the columns. And the first one is alphabet knowledge. Then we've got phonological awareness, print concepts, name writing, vocabulary, story retell, and story comprehension. And then what we've done is that every task sort of had its associated norms. And then what we did is we didn't have a what we call a control group of typically developing children, but we compared our group of preschoolers on the spectrum to published norms. And if the children scored within sort of age expected norms, that's what I've put on this graph. So for example, on the left-hand side, we've got 63% of children showed within age expectations on alphabet knowledge. Phonological awareness, it was 75%, print concepts 40, name writing 56, vocabulary 56, and then look at story retell and comprehension. So what we can see is that at group level, our children, or the children in our study, showed relative strengths in print-related skills of alphabet knowledge and phonological awareness, and significant challenges in story retell and comprehension. Then when we followed the children 1 year later, when they were at the end of their first year of schooling, so we call that prep in Queensland, and I think it's kinder in New South Wales and Victoria, we found that about half of the children were able to read a short passage. Now what we used was the York Assessment of Reading for Comprehension, and at age 5.5 we would expect children to actually be able to master that short passage on that particular task. So a skill that most 5.5-year-olds should master. So what this means is that 44% of the children in our study that we followed up performed within grade expectations, but 56% of the kids showed significant reading accuracy difficulties. So they had difficulties recognizing the words on a page, right? And then more concerningly, just over 80% of the children showed very early reading comprehension deficits. So that leads us to one big common myth that we really need to get rid of, and that often when we talk about that we do research or we're interested in literacy in children on the autism spectrum, people tell us, oh, but these children are super readers and they are amazing. They will learn to read before they start school. And actually, yes, that's true for about 6 to 10% of children on the spectrum. But generally speaking, we cannot say that children with autism show strengths in decoding as we've shown. So what I'm going to do now is I'll hand you over to Jess, who's going to talk about a whole long list of why children on the autism spectrum may be at risk of literacy difficulties.
Great, thanks Marlene. And so there's a number of characteristics of autism that are core features, that are also associated features, or are co-occurring conditions which might contribute to putting students on the autism spectrum at risk of reading difficulties. So when we're talking about the autism core features, what I mean is the restricted interest and repetitive behaviours, and the social communication difficulties, which are the core diagnostic features. When I'm talking about associated cognitive features, what I'm talking about is the thinking and reasoning characteristics such as difficulties with theory of mind or social understanding, a bias towards focusing on details that we call a local processing bias, and some challenges around the area of executive functioning, so difficulties with, say, working memory and mental flexibility. In terms of co-occurring conditions, I'm going to be breaking down the potential impact of co-occurring conditions such as language difficulties, behaviour and mental health, and associated intellectual impairments that we see in a substantial proportion of people on the autism spectrum. So starting with those core characteristics, we diagnose autism on the basis of two core behavioural features, and those are social communication and repetitive and restricted behaviours. So social communication can manifest as difficulties with establishing and maintaining relationships. So this can be from not being interested in social interactions through to those who are interested but have difficulties in sustaining and appropriate social interactions. We can also see challenges in non-verbal communication, so this can extend to things like not following joint attention or eye gaze to focus on things. And if we consider the impact that may have on learning and acquiring skills in the literacy domain, if you're not able to follow someone's visual attention to what they're looking at to understand, say, the written word or the pictures associated with the text. And we can also see difficulties with maintaining and establishing relationships. This may impact on things like engagement in particular activities, such as in shared book reading, which we know is an important behaviour that parents can engage in the home that supports the development of those early foundations in emergent literacy skills. In the area of restricted and repetitive behaviours, that we know diagnostic criteria is having at least two of these. And so we can see individuals who have stereotyped or repetitive movements, and so the level of the interests and behaviours might interfere with access to learning opportunities. We can also see an insistence on sameness and things being done a particular way, which again may influence engagement with particular activities such as reading. We can also see circumscribed or specific interests. So if your interest is on something very, very specific, it might be that it's very difficult to engage you in learning or reading activities that are outside that interest area, which can limit your breadth of exposure and opportunities for learning. We can also see differences in sensory responsivity. So having your senses turned up or turned down could be a general risk factor for engaging in, say, the classroom, which can be quite a noisy, a bright, and overwhelming sort of situation. And we know that for each individual, there is a spectrum, and that's why we've got the colour wheel up here, that we can see differences in the level of support for each of these domains. So understanding the particular kaleidoscope of areas of strengths and areas of challenges for a particular individual is really important to understand the impact the support needs they may have for their particular learning or their engagement. And that can range from requiring some support through to requiring very substantial support. And that can be different for each of the two domains. So you might have particular difficulties in one domain and not as many difficulties or levels of support in the other. And when we put that together to get autism, we have this combination of both those core features, as we've got in purple and red here, as well as co-occurring conditions. And that we know that those co-occurring conditions tend to be the rule rather than the exception. So most individuals would have at least one of these, and I'm going to break these down in more detail in later slides, but they might include things like intellectual or language impairments, other neurological, mental or behavioural conditions, and other medical and genetic conditions as well. And all of these may have an impact on the person's ability to engage and to benefit from activities that may foster their development of reading and other associated skills. And so when we look in detail here about social communication, I've hinted on this a little bit already, that this can require having the desire to communicate, something to communicate about, a way to communicate, an ability to detect a response, ability to interpret the intent of the message, and that includes both written and spoken messages. So think if you have difficulties with understanding somebody's intention of their speech, how that might impact on your comprehension, particularly of things like narratives. and the ability to respond to the intent of this, so to respond appropriately as well. And consider then how this might then affect your engagement and your participation and your comprehension of reading and reading related activities. Now, we also move to restricted interests. So I discussed that these might be unusual interests. They might also be unusual in their intensity. So a common feature that we hear is that sometimes for females in particular, it may be that the level of intensity is what's unusual rather than the type of interest that, they might just really love Elsa, and certainly I've worked with clients where it had to be a specific Elsa dress from Frozen every single day. But that also might be the only thing that they're interested in learning or reading about, which could be very challenging. It can also be around the type. So I've certainly worked with children who they have kind of unusual interests. So for example, it might be garbage bins and having to know the particular garbage bins. But it has to be particular in a real garbage bin. So learning about Oscar the Grouch that lives in a garbage bin actually isn't of interest because I want to know about the type, the colour, the material and fact-based information. And so it's not just about relating activity to the interest. Sometimes there's a very specific interest can make it very challenging. But promisingly, we did find in our research into shared book reading that with support and encouragement and making it fun, that we can actually increase the range of interest and diversity of reading activities. And Marlene's going to break that down in a bit more detail later on. In terms of repetitive behaviours, so this can be motor or verbal behaviours, and it can also manifest as an insistence on sameness and things being done a particular way over and over again. For example, having to read a book in a particular way over and over again, which may limit the opportunities for learning if there's no deviation from that script or if there's no diversity in the reading materials. It may also lead to some strengths if there's a focus on particular things like letters or there are particular interests, for example. And it may, however, be a challenge too if there's difficulties of generalising learning from one context to another. For example, from lowercase to uppercase, being stuck on letter names instead of letter sounds. So this rigidity can be a barrier as well. And the function of these behaviours can vary between individuals, and understanding that function can help us to work with that in the context of reading. So if it's for self-regulation is helpful for the individual, we might look at how we can incorporate that. If it's sensory seeking, maybe there's another way that doesn't interfere with learning that we can meet those needs or interests. So then moving away from those core characteristics, we look at the thinking and reasoning, or what we would call the cognitive features. And 3 core cognitive explanations for autism have come up in the past. Now, back when I was doing my PhD, we really thought we were going to find the one that explained the features of autism, but it seems that these 3 overlapping explanations can provide some insight into the specific strengths we see in autism, as well as some of the challenges. And so we have what is now called central coherence, executive functioning, and theory of mind theories of autism, which have implications for reading. So if we start with central coherence, I've put a picture here of a forest because it often gets called that we can't see the forest for all the trees. And what I mean by that is getting very stuck on the details rather than looking at the big picture. And in recent years, we've moved away from calling it weak central coherence because it seems like it's more of a bias on looking at those details, or the trees in this case, rather than not being able to look at the big picture. And it can explain some of the strengths we see in autism. Sometimes we might see excellent recall. They can tell the story back verbatim. We can pick out specific pictures, very good at maybe finding the picture in like a Where's Wally book, or the academic version of that is an embedded figures test where you're finding a specific detail in a picture. But it also can explain some of the challenges we see. So you may have had students who could tell you the whole story that happened in a movie verbatim, but then if you ask what it's about, who the character was, what the problem was, what the solution, they might have a lot of difficulty extracting that meaning from the story. And so we can have difficulty then processing the context and the bigger picture, or using prior knowledge to understand the story and comprehend the story. And so we can see then how that might impact on your ability to acquire reading comprehension in particular, and we might have difficulties too generalising from one story to another, for example. Our other cognitive feature we're talking about here is executive functioning. And this is really, you can see the person balancing here, is like your brain has an executive, and that's based on your frontal lobe. And this is responsible for your ability to hold information in your mind, to use it, to find it when you need it, to stop yourself from saying things or doing things you shouldn't, and to have that capacity to juggle it all. And that equates to your working memory as your capacity, your response inhibition is your ability to stop yourself from saying stuff you shouldn't, the ability to multitask, that ability to shift from one thing to another. We can see how that translates to that cognitive inflexibility we can see. Difficulties shifting attention from one thing to another. And difficulties planning and organising, as you can see, might make you vulnerable to challenges in school more broadly. And if you're thinking this sounds a lot like ADHD, that's because it does. So these are difficulties that we also see in ADHD, and we do see a high co-occurrence of autism and ADHD. It's about 50%, but we also see individuals with autism who do not have ADHD but still have difficulties with these areas too. And that can influence learning broadly, but also specifically when we think about the impact of things like working memory on reading ability. Finally, we talk about theory of mind when we're thinking about cognitive explanations or features of autism. I can see here this meme you've probably seen going around, which is like, he's cheating on me meme, that she's thinking he's cheating on her and he's thinking about Buzz Lightyear and why he stopped when the humans were around. It's a bit of a silly example here, but you can imagine how that might impact on the behaviour you have, and that he's just thinking about something totally unrelated, but she might snob him or refuse to talk to him if she thinks he's thinking about other girls. And we can see how understanding other people's thinking helps us then to predict their behaviour and to understand their intentions and their feelings. Now, this is something that also gets called cognitive empathy, that we have found in research that many people on the autism spectrum have difficulty with. Now, that should be differentiated from emotional empathy, that we know that individuals on the spectrum, they might feel sad when you feel sad, but where they might have difficulty is understanding why you feel sad, how you're going to act, and what would make you feel better. Now, that's not to say it's everyone, but it does tend to be a common feature. And you can imagine when we're looking at stories and narratives that we need this ability to understand and predict story characters' feelings, to understand their belief, to understand mysteries, for example, to understand what they would know and how they'd act. So this have ramifications then for story comprehension, particularly of narratives. Finally, we'll want to cover co-occurring conditions. So as I mentioned previously, these tend to be the rule rather than the exception. So for people diagnosed with autism, the most common ones are language difficulties. So we know that while it's no longer part of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, that up to about 40% of individuals will show difficulties in their expressive, that's their use, or their receptive, that's their understanding of language. And this can include things like delays in spoken language development and ongoing difficulties in those receptive and expressive language skills that are very common, affecting about 40% of individuals. Although they're not strictly part of the diagnostic criteria, they're often the red flag that leads to parents coming to see us in the first place. Next, as I mentioned previously, ADHD, depending on the study you look at, it's between 40 to 70% of individuals. And we know that ADHD can affect your ability to engage, participate, and learn from reading and other classes. We also know that mood disorders and anxiety are very prevalent too. So rates go between about 40 and 70% here of those that having a depressed mood or feeling very anxious can affect your ability to learn and is a risk factor in general for difficulties in school. And we also see difficulties around thinking and reasoning in terms of intellectual ability. So approximately 30% of individuals with autism will also have an intellectual impairment. And so when we move then to breaking this down in a bit more detail, we look at language difficulties. I mentioned that this can be receptive and expressive, but it can also be at the word level, so understanding vocabulary. It can be at the sentence level, so difficulty with understanding how sentences work around syntax and the grammar. And it can also be at the text level around understanding narratives and explanations, for example. And we know that the ability to connect ideas within and between sentences, so to extract that bigger meaning, and those inferencing skills are important then for comprehension. And as I touched on previously, this also links with the ability to have theory of mind when we're looking at mental state inferences. In terms of looking at behaviour and mental health, reflect for a second and think about what have you observed in your classroom or at home? Outside of the student's autism, what else have you seen happening for your students from that list of co-occurring conditions I mentioned? You might be thinking of some of these. So you might be thinking of mood disorders, anxiety, ADHD, being distracted, you might see school refusal, and this can all impact on understanding and ability to follow through with tasks, expectations. And we do see higher levels of challenging behaviours as well, and often as a response to these other challenges. And this can all impact on the ability to engage and learn in both the classroom and also at home too, and things like refusal to do homework we often see as well. In terms of our intellectual functioning, the diagnostic criteria for intellectual functioning is that you're going to be slower to acquire knowledge and need more support to acquire the same skills, and you may hit a ceiling in your development. And so this has a functional impact on learning, that individuals with autism and an intellectual impairment have additional supports in terms of the number of repetitions, the amount of learning they need to do, and the level of support they need to acquire the same skills as their peers. What can make this particularly challenging is that we can see what's called diagnostic overshadowing, where while it's best practice to do a cognitive assessment a part of the diagnosis, in practice it's actually not done very often because it is an additional substantial cost that's not funded by Medicare. And so this can mean that intellectual impairments are sometimes missed at the point of diagnosis, or difficulties in learning are attributed solely to the autism, and the intellectual impairment may be picked up later. Another area of intellectual functioning that can have ramifications for understanding ability level is uneven profiles we can see. So we do sometimes see individuals who have strengths in their verbal abilities, but then they have difficulties in their processing speed, where they might need longer to respond to the information. They might have more limited working memory capacity, so they need to have more visual supports, for example, to help them to comprehend and respond to information. But if the expectations are set on that high verbal ability, they might not be able to meet those expectations across different levels, and that can lead to frustration and challenging behaviour as well. And so then drawing this back together, let's look at our findings as they relate to preschool and what early predictors we can use to predict what's happening at school age. And I'm going to pass back to Malaine to cover these findings in the field of autism. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go back to our findings then, and hopefully this has given you some appreciation of the many factors that may contribute to literacy difficulties in children on the autism spectrum. So what we found is at preschool, as I've said earlier, that many children showed strengths in alphabet knowledge, but not everyone. And that up to 40% of preschool-age children did not meet expectations on these print-related skills, which really then resulted in our myth-busting slide. And then oral language-related is that most preschoolers struggled retelling a story, and that story comprehension was a particular challenge. And then linking back to the simple view of reading, we know that we need all of these skills for successful reading comprehension to occur. And then when we looked from preschool to prep, so that's their first year of schooling to year 2, what we found is that children who show strong word reading skills in their first year of schooling perform better on all emergent literacy tasks in preschool. So that was looking back at, okay, what were they like when we tested them a year previously? And these included vocabulary, letter sound knowledge, phonological awareness, and name writing. Plus, story comprehension in preschool was linked to reading comprehension 2 years later in year 2. And that is just like we would expect in typical development, which is really actually quite comforting to know, because that means that some of the assessments we have in place for children who are typically developing, or we know are at risk of developmental language disorder, or who may be at risk of reading difficulties for other reasons, and we can use similar tasks, and we may potentially use similar intervention activities. So in summary then, early identification of literacy-related strengths and challenges is crucial. Because if we can identify these children early, then we can provide intervention early. And then we can hopefully give these children a little push in the back to make sure that their literacy development happens, basically. Because it's what we find in other studies is that once you reach that end of your first year of schooling, if you're not on the road to reading success, it is really tricky to stay motivated in learning to read. And if you lose motivation, then you've got this other additional factor that will make it harder to continue your reading sort of trajectory. So what we've done is we've created a teacher checklist that we can use at school entry. And what we can do with that checklist is we can just check children's performance on key emergent literacy skills just before they enter school. And of course, not surprisingly, these key emergent literacy skills are phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge, name writing, vocabulary, but also attention and comprehension of a story and storytelling. So what we've done is we've created a demonstration video for educators, and we've had input from educators, sort of summarizing what we knew at that stage. And you can find the links on our website, and I will give you the name of the website on the last slide. That video is about 12 minutes, and it just runs you through some of the concepts that we've just talked about. And hopefully that'll be a nice video to watch and to share with others who may be interested in this topic. But then going back to our checklist, this checklist was based on our findings. So it's not norm referenced. It is not, you can't say these children will definitely be at risk. But what you can do, for example, and I'll just have to look at the slide, it's a little bit closer by. If a child has letter sound awareness with at least 7 letter sounds correct, then that was sort of a developmental expectation at prep entry for our group of preschoolers. And those children were more likely to do better 1 year later. And then the next line, for example, is first sound awareness. If a child can identify at least the first letter in 6 words, then again, that was a nice indicator that the child was starting to learn those skills. So what we want to do with this checklist is really raise awareness of the importance of individualized assessment or checking off of skills to make sure that we can individualize the supports that these children may need. And this is the second page of the checklist. But as I said, that checklist has already been uploaded and we're more than happy for you to use it and to email us if you have any questions about it. But let's look at a quick example. So our first example is Byron. And Byron, when we saw him at time 1, so that is when he was preschooler, he was 4 years, 7 months. And what we can see is on letter sound awareness, he had a score of 0, so he didn't know any letter sounds. He couldn't identify the first sound in words, so that's phonological awareness. For name writing, he gave it a really good try, and he had a score of 2 out of a total of 7. Now, in vocabulary, we actually used that standardized test, so we used the Peabody picture vocabulary test, and a standard score of 77 tells us that he's below age expectations, but he definitely participated in that task and he knew lots of words. Then when we tested his story retelling and comprehension, his attention was adequate. He definitely listened to the story and he gave a good try and he gave us answers to the questions, but he got none of the questions correct after listening to a short story about a girl who got lost. He attempted to retell the story, but most of his attempts were actually unrelated to the original story, and so we couldn't give him a score for his ability to sequence the events of a story correctly. And compare his profile to Lockie, and that's not his real name. So Lockie at time 1 was age 5 years, 4 months. He knew 25 letter sounds. He could identify the initial sound in the 10 words that we gave him. Name writing, he only got a score of 2, just like Byron. The Peabody picture vocabulary test, very similar score to Byron, he scored 78. Attending was appropriate, he answered 1 question correct. He knew who found Anna, it was the policeman. He attempted to retell the story and he gave us a little bit of information about the character, so that's Anna, and about the resolution, so she got home safely, or the policeman found her. But again, his sequencing, he only gave us 2 unrelated utterances, so that was not applicable. So basically then, if we compare Byron to Lockie, hopefully you can straight away see that these children will need very different levels of support. They really both need oral language input, especially with an emphasis on vocabulary and also story retelling and comprehension. But Byron, in addition, really needs some systematic explicit instruction in phonological awareness and letter name, letter sound awareness. All right, so our big take-home messages are, not surprisingly, assess, don't assume. We really do need to understand each student's literacy profile. Take each child's individual strengths and challenges into account. And as Jess pointed out, there's many of them, but they include restricted interests, a detail-focused cognitive style of processing, theory of mind challenges, executive functioning and behavior, right? To really help us understand why might this be more challenging for this child compared to his peer who's also struggling, but perhaps for different reasons. And use a team approach. We really want to work with, of course, I would say the speech pathologist, but also autism coaches psychologists and parents, I really think that together we can give the child the best possible chance of reading success. So what's next? And I'm talking about 2021. We've just in the process of setting up a literacy assessment clinic. We have obtained some funding, and we will be offering literacy assessments for children who've been diagnosed with ASD, who are attending school, and this assessment will be free of charge, and you'll receive a report with recommendations. And we're also conducting a research project into story comprehension skills of children on the spectrum, where we really want to tease apart the inferential comprehension abilities and how they relate to theory of mind. So if anyone is interested in any of our research projects, or want to know more information, or want to just ask us anything to do with literacy and autism, then please contact us. If you live on the Gold Coast or in the Brisbane area and you're interested in participating at those two initiatives, then please contact us as well. So the last few slides, we've just outlined some useful resources, and I won't read them out, and I'll make sure that there's a bibliography as well. And then on the final one, I do want to give a quick plug about my open access book. If you're interested in reading more about the simple view of reading and how an assessment framework using that simple view might work in a school context, then please feel free to download the book. It's a thin one, so hopefully easy to get through. For links to any of our work, visit my website or contact us. And we really want to acknowledge Kate O'Leary, our amazing speech pathologist, who's been our research assistant and colleague on all of these projects, and some of our work was supported by the Autism CRC. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.